أعلن افتتاح الجلسة العامة الثانية والعشرين للجمعية العامة.
The 22nd plenary meeting of the General Assembly is called to order. The Assembly will continue its consideration of Agenda Item 38, entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba.
Representative of St. Kitts and Nevis.
Mr. President, St. Kitts and Nevis aligns itself with the statement that have been delivered by Barbados on behalf of the Caribbean community, CARICOM. We extend a very warm welcome to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Perea. Mr. President, the government and people of St. Kitts and Nevis stands in solidarity with our Caribbean brothers and sisters who have been impacted by the catastrophic and destructive Hurricane Melissa. We acknowledge that the road to recovery will be challenging, but we are confident that as a global community, our collective efforts will see you through. Mr. President, we are gathered here today to reiterate the urgent need to end the unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba, as we also call for a removal of Cuba from the list of states sponsoring terrorism. Mr. President, it has been more than 6 decades that the embargo has caused significant hardship to the government and people of Cuba, particularly the elderly, children, and most vulnerable populations. Recent data has signaled that during the period March 1st, 2024 to February 28th, 2025, the material damage and losses caused by the embargo have increased by an alarming 49%. Mr. President, Cuba is not only our fellow Caribbean neighbor by geography, but Cuba has remained a strategic and reliable partner and friend to the Caribbean community, assisting us in bolstering our efforts, especially in providing tertiary education for our people and buttressing the provision of specialized medical care for the most vulnerable of our societies. And for this, we are immensely appreciative. We therefore stand in solidarity with the government and people of Cuba as an expression of our commitment to the deep bonds of friendship and shared values that continue to unite us. Mr. President, St. Kitts and Nevis thanks the Secretary General for his usual comprehensive report on this item and applauds the United Nations for its consistent efforts for more than 3 decades in bringing this annual resolution to the General Assembly. The resolution continues to provide an opportunity for the world to be reminded of the plight of the Cuban people. In closing, Mr. President, St. Kitts and Nevis renews its advocacy for the end of the imposition of the embargo against Cuba.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of St. Kitts and Nevis. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Mr. President, my delegation would like to thank the Secretary General for his comprehensive report on this agenda item. I also wish to extend our warm welcome to His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba. Vietnam aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda, Iraq, and Singapore on behalf of the Non-Aligned Movement, the Group of 77 in China, and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, respectively. These statements reaffirm the shared conviction of the overwhelming majority of UN membership that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba must be lifted fully, unconditionally, and without delay. Mr. President, more than 6 decades on, this unilateral embargo continues to stand in contradiction to the purposes and principles of the UN Charter and international law, including sovereign equality, non-interference in internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. The embargo has inflicted severe and prolonged hardship on the Cuban people. It violates the legitimate rights to development and undermines the very spirit of multilateralism and humanity that the United Nations represents. According to Cuba's most recent report to the United Nations, the embargo caused losses exceeding $7.5 billion between March 2024 and February 2025, a nearly 50% increase from the previous year. Behind these figures are the daily struggles of the ordinary people: limited access to medicines, food, and energy, the essential foundations for human dignity and progress. Mr. President, at the high-level general debate of the 80th session of the General Assembly, President Lương Cường of Vietnam reiterated our call for the complete lifting of all sanctions against Cuba and for the removal of Cuba from the so-called state sponsors of terrorism list. This reflects Vietnam's unwavering solidarity with Cuba and our belief that dialogue and engagement, not isolation, are the only viable path towards reconciliation and shared prosperity. Vietnam therefore joins the international community in once again calling for the end of this outdated and unjust policy and urges all states to refrain from applying or enforcing extraterritorial measures that contravene international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Vietnam's own experience testifies to the transformative power of dialogue and reconciliation. 30 years after the lifting of US embargoes and the normalization of bilateral relations, Vietnam and the United States have become comprehensive strategic partners. The two countries now work closely across a wide range of areas, turning confrontation into cooperation and past enmity into partnership grounded in mutual respect and benefit. This transformation has brought tangible benefits to both peoples. Educational and cultural exchanges have deepened mutual understanding, two-way trade and investment have grown exponentially, and cooperation in science and technology has opened new opportunities for shared growth. This experience stands as living proof that when nations choose dialogue over division and respect over resentment, they can together build a future of trust and shared progress. Vietnam sincerely hopes that this same spirit of reconciliation and forward-looking approach will one day define relations between the United States and Cuba. We nevertheless remain concerned that recent policy developments appear to move in the opposite direction, with tighter restrictions and stricter enforcement of the embargo. Vietnam encourages a careful reassessment of these measures in a spirit of dialogue, humanitarian consideration, and respect for international law. Mr. President, the continuation of the embargo against Cuba is morally indefensible, legally untenable, and economically counterproductive. It serves no constructive purpose other than to prolong hardship and erode confidence in the values we collectively uphold. Vietnam therefore calls upon the General Assembly to once again adopt the resolution in consideration, not merely as an act of solidarity with Cuba, but as a reaffirmation of the UN Charter, the principles of international law, and the collective conscience of humanity. Vietnam will continue to stand firm in supporting Cuba's right to sovereignty, self-determination, and development, confident that the principle of justice, dialogue, and cooperation will ultimately prevail. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Vietnam. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Mr. President, Malaysia aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of ASEAN, NAM, Group of 77, and China, and the OIC. Mr. President, Malaysia joins others in strongly opposing the imposition of unilateral coercive measures against any country, including Cuba. Such measures are inconsistent with the principles of sovereign equality and contravene international law, international humanitarian law, the Charter of the United Nations, and the norms and principles of peaceful resolutions among states. The long-standing unilateral coercive measures against Cuba have severely constrained the economy and restricted its ability to develop. Between March 2024 and February 2025, the blockade has resulted in losses exceeding $7 billion, which is about 49% more compared to the same period in the previous year. In addition, the blockade had adversely affected Cuba's commercial relations, creating serious obstacles in the banking and financial operations, international trade, access to credit and financing, fuel procurement, and engagement with suppliers critical to national development. It has also discouraged foreign investment. The country has lost vital income needed to purchase food, medicines, and medical supplies, including powdered milk for children and essential items for social development. These illegal measures have further undermined key sectors such as tourism, biotechnology, energy and mining, information and communications technology, construction, and transport. The cumulative impact has constrained Cuba's growth and negatively impacted the well-being of its people. The unilateral economic, commercial, and financial embargo against Cuba must end immediately and unconditionally, including the removal of Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list. Mr. President, there is an urgent need to eliminate the practice of imposing unilateral coercive measures as a means of pursuing political objectives. The real victims are the ordinary people who are deprived of social economic development and essential services, including education and healthcare for the children. Therefore, Malaysia continues to support the annual United Nations General Assembly resolution entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. In this regard, Malaysia calls upon the parties concerned to resolve their differences through dialogue and to refrain from actions that are not consistent with international law and UN practices. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Malaysia. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, Indonesia aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of ASEAN, the Non-Aligned Movement, the OIC, and the Group of 77 in China. Indonesia echoes the Secretary General's report, which highlights the severe and continuing impact of the embargo on the people of Cuba, from economic hardship and developmental stagnation, to restriction on access to food, medicine, and other essential supplies. The economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba contradicts to the fundamental principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. Embargo has not only hindered Cuba's economic growth, but has also exacerbated its socio-economic challenges. Such conditions undermine the implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and jeopardize our shared commitment to leaving no one behind. Mr. President, unilateral acts such as this embargo have consistently eroded trust in multilateralism and weakened collective efforts to achieve global prosperity. This embargo, which has endured longer than any other unilateral measure in modern history, represents a continuing obstacle to international cooperation. In this regard, Indonesia rejects all attempt to further strengthen the unilateral embargo against Cuba. We reaffirm our principled position in support of the resolution calling for its immediate termination. We also support the call to delist Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism. Mr. President, ending the embargo would not only improve the welfare and uphold the legitimate rights of the Cuban people, including its right to development, but also restore the integrity of this assembly and reaffirm our commitment to multilateralism. Indonesia will continue to stand in solidarity with Cuba and with all nations that uphold the principles of international law, equality, and justice, as we strive together to realize our shared vision of peace, dignity, and prosperity for all. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indonesia. ويسرني الآن أن أعطي الكلمة.
And it's now my pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Algeria.
Mr. President, Algeria aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group, the OIC, NAM, and the G77. We wish to add the following remarks on our national capacity. At the outset, Algeria is honored to welcome His Excellency Mr. Bruno Rodriguez Parilla, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Cuba. We commend his country's enduring commitment to the principles of solidarity, dignity, and independence. We also express our appreciation to the Secretary General for his comprehensive reports on this important matter, containing in document A/80/83. Mr. President, guided by the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, Algeria reiterates its unwavering support for the immediate and unconditional lifting of the unjust economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba for more than 6 decades. This policy runs contrary to the fundamental principles of international law and of the Charter of the United Nations, including the sovereign equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs, and freedom of international trade and navigation. It remains one of the most enduring examples of unilateral coercive measures that contravene the spirit of multilateralism and the collective objective of the United Nations. Algeria expresses its deep concern and disappointment at the persistence of this embargo, its humanitarian and socio-economic consequences have been extensively documented in the Secretary General's report. The blockade continues to impose enormous hardship on the Cuban people and severely undermines Cuba's efforts to achieve the SDGs by 2030. We strongly oppose, by principle, the imposition of unilateral laws and decisions that affect the sovereignty and development of other states. Algeria firmly rejects all unilateral coercive measures not authorized by the relevant organs of the United Nations, as they violate human rights, as they hinder international cooperation, as they obstruct the well-being of peoples. In this context, Algeria calls for the removal of Cuba from the unilateral list of alleged state sponsors of terrorism, a designation that is unjustified and detrimental to international trust and cooperation. Finally, President, we reaffirm our steadfast support and fraternity and solidarity with Cuba. Accordingly, my delegation will vote in favor of the draft resolution, as we have consistently done in previous years. I thank you.
أشكر سعادة المندوب الدائم.
I thank His Excellency, the Permanent Representative of Algeria.
To the distinguished representative of Laos People Democratic Republic.
Mr. President, my delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda, Iraq, and Singapore on behalf of NAM, the G77, and China and ASEAN, respectively, and echoes the principal call to end the embargo against Cuba. We would like to warmly welcome the presence of His Excellency Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez Parilla of Cuba at this session, and also would like to thank the Secretary General for his report on this important agenda item. The Lao PDR reiterates its unwavering solidarity with the people and government of Cuba. The embargo, which has remained in place for more than 6 decades, is in direct contradiction to the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter and well-established norms of international law. This prolonged and unilateral measure has not only inflicted severe socioeconomic consequences on the Cuban people, but also hindered their legitimate right to development, sovereignty, and national self-determination. At a time when the world is facing unprecedented challenges, from widening inequalities and intensified geopolitical tensions to global health crisis and climate-related disasters, it is morally indefensible and politically unjustifiable to maintain coercive measures that exacerbate human suffering and restrict inclusive development. The Lao PDR strongly believes that no country should be denied the opportunity to chart its own development path free from external pressure and interference. In this regard, we support the adoption of the successor resolution under this agenda item, namely Resolution A/80/L.6, and recognize it as a resounding expression of the view of the international community, a consistent call for justice, fairness, and respect for international law. It is through such multilateral actions that we pave the way towards a more peaceful, equitable, and just world for all nations, large and small. Mr. President, the Lao PDR is of the view that unilateral coercive measures not only contradict the UN Charter and international law, but also hinder sustainable development and impose unjust suffering on innocent people. We must therefore redouble our efforts to foster an enabling environment for peace and development cooperation among all nations. In this regard, the Lao PDR once again joins the international community in calling for the ending of the economic, commercial, and financial embargo against the Republic of Cuba, as well as for the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism, and the elimination of all unilateral coercive measures imposed on sovereign countries. In conclusion, the Lao PDR called on all member states to renew our collective resolve to uphold the Charter of the United Nations, safeguard the sovereign rights of nations, and foster inclusive and sustainable development, especially for countries unjustly affected by coercive measures, and to ensure that the people of Cuba, like all peoples around the world, are given the freedom to thrive and determine their own destiny. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Laos People's Democratic Republic. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by thanking you for convening this important meeting to consider once again the urgent necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba. This debate is central to our collective commitment to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and the sovereign equality of all states. My delegation aligns itself with the statements delivered on behalf of the African Group, NAM, and the G77 and China. We add the following remarks in a national capacity. We welcome the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, His Excellency Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. We commend the government of Cuba for highlighting the devastating impact of the blockade on the daily lives and well-being of the Cuban people. Cuba's most recent report offers a sobering account of human suffering, an undeniable indictment of the far-reaching consequences of unilateral coercive measures. It makes clear that with each passing day, the blockade not only inflicts pain on ordinary people, but it also hinders Cuba's path towards sustainable development. Mr. President, that the General Assembly has been seized with this matter for the 33rd consecutive year is a stark reminder that the will of the international community continues to be disregarded. While resolutions have consistently expressed overwhelming rejection of the embargo, meaningful progress towards its removal have remained elusive. This persistent defiance of international law has subjected the Cuban people to prolonged hardships and constitutes a flagrant violation of their sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Equally concerning is the continued unjustified inclusion of Cuba on the so-called list of state sponsors of terrorism, an action that has further curtailed the country's access to international financial systems and development programs. The cumulative effect of these measures has been the deliberate obstruction of Cuba's socio-economic progress, in clear contradiction to the spirit of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Mr. President, No country should be denied access to life-saving medicines, technology, financial services, agricultural equipment, and fair trade. Yet this remains the daily reality for the people of Cuba under the weight of an embargo devoid of moral or legal legitimacy. The continuation of this policy is an affront to multilateralism, an impediment to development, and a violation of the fundamental rights and dignity of the entire nation. Zimbabwe is also a victim of unilateral coercive measures. We too have witnessed firsthand how these measures can asphyxiate economies and restrict social progress. We stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba, both as a matter of principle and as a testament to the bonds of friendship that exist between our two countries and peoples. We therefore reiterate our call for member states to refrain from enacting and enforcing unilateral measures contrary to international law and the purposes and principles of the Charter. Mr. President, Zimbabwe commends the government and people of Cuba for their resilience in the face of injustice. Despite these formidable challenges, Cuba continues to meaningfully contribute towards international cooperation through medical brigades. These medical brigades have saved millions of lives across the world. In conclusion, the impact of the blockade on the population of Cuba is well documented. The overwhelming support for the resolution calling for its end is enduring. What is required now is decisive action. Our unified call for the United States to review its policy of sanctions and to lift the embargo should persist until the people of Cuba are free to earnestly pursue sustainable development. We also call for the immediate removal of Cuba from the so-called list of state sponsors of terrorism, a designation that is both unjust and detrimental to international cooperation. Zimbabwe will continue to stand in solidarity with the people of Cuba and advocate for the respect of multilateralism, mutual respect, and adherence to the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I would begin by welcoming the presence of the Foreign Minister of Cuba, Don Bruno Rodriguez, at the General Assembly. Year after year, we meet in this forum with the unequivocal expectation that an end will be brought to the economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed against Cuba for more than 6 decades. We see that the member states of the United Nations have each year and overwhelmingly voted in favor of lifting the blockade. However, there is continued disrespect for this majority will of the international community and of the resolutions of this General Assembly. It would seem that we still cannot escape from the prejudices and intolerances that characterized the policy of the politics of the Cold War, which in historical terms has proven without question to have failed. In the context of the recent high-level week, the Secretary of Foreign Relations of Mexico reiterated our historic stance against the embargo and the call for removing Cuba from the list of states that support terrorism. The minister also said that Mexico will always advocate for the peaceful settlement of disputes and therefore rejects sanctions and commercial blockades that only harm the well-being of peoples and do not build regions of peace or of prosperity. Mexico also categorically condemns the application of Title III of the law of the so-called Helms-Burton Act. This is a measure that affects not only the sovereignty of the Cuban people, but also the national interests of third countries. It must be said clearly that any unilateral measure conceived of as a form of political pressure to influence the internal decisions of another state is a contravention of the principles of the United Nations Charter, as well as the constitutional principles of Mexico's foreign policy, and it is an impingement upon peace and stability between peoples. And it is the UN Charter itself, which in Chapter 7 exclusively reserves for the Security Council the capacity to impose sanctions or other coercive measures for the maintenance of international peace. Therefore, Mexico maintains that there should be no sanctions of any sort beyond those that are adopted by the Security Council. Mr. President, Cuba is facing an economic crisis even worse than the one in the 1990s that is aggravated by the embargo and the strengthening of sanctions by the United States government. The country is even continuing to suffer from the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, while the rest of the international community has managed to turn the page on this page of our contemporary history. That is compounded by high international oil prices, which is the result of conflicts that Cuba has nothing to do with, and natural disasters that continue to lash the entire Caribbean, hindering growth and economic well-being through unilateral impositions is contrary to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals and equality of opportunities, which is something that Mexico advocates for in all international fora. The Cuban people deserves a more encouraging future, and they deserve not to be subject to decisions that were taken in a historical, political, and economic context that is very far removed from the one we live in today. New generations of Cubans deserve to live outside of the context of confrontation that Cuba was put in by the circumstances of the Cold War. At the same time, relations between neighbors on the American continent, based on respect and mutual understanding, are essential for the growth and development of the countries of the hemisphere. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Mexico.
I have the pleasure now to give the floor to Her Excellency, Deputy Permanent Representative of Egypt. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, at the outset, I would like to express my gratitude to the Secretary General for his report on the necessity of ending the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba. My country aligns itself with the statements delivered by the Group of 77 and China, the African Group, the Non-Aligned Group, and the OIC. Mr. President, Egypt reaffirms its steadfast position in support of Cuba in facing these sanctions. The unilateral measures imposed on Cuba have a direct and negative impact on all aspects of the social and economic life of the Cuban people. It constitutes a serious obstacle to development efforts. Egypt believes that the continuation of this embargo for more than 6 decades runs counter to the principles of the Charter and the rules of international law. It also undermines collective efforts aiming at respecting multilateralism and achieving international cooperation and sustainable development. President, Egypt emphasizes the importance of respecting the General Assembly decisions and the other resolutions calling for ending this embargo. It stresses that the continuation of UCMs does not serve the objectives of international cooperation nor the spirit of solidarity that our multilateral system needs in these difficult circumstances. We call for a complete and immediate lifting of the embargo imposed on Cuba to enable its people to achieve their legitimate aspirations for development and prosperity. Thank you, President.
أشكر سعادة نائب المندوب الدائم لجمهورية مصر العربية. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. President, Ghana aligns herself with statements delivered by the G77 and China, the African Group, and the Non-Aligned Movement. We speak at this moment in our national capacity and take this opportunity to thank the Secretary General for his report A/80/83. Mr. President, few issues before this Assembly speak as powerfully to our shared conscience as the continuing economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on the Republic of Cuba. For more than 6 decades, this measure has stood as a moral, legal, and economic contradiction to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, namely the sovereign equality, non-interference, and the right of all peoples to pursue their own development in dignity and peace. Ghana has consistently and resolutely advocated for an end to the embargo because we believe that no nation should be denied the opportunity to participate fully and freely in global trade, nor deprived of the means to uplift the well-being of its citizens. This conviction is grounded in the 1986 Declaration on the Right to Development and reaffirmed in numerous resolutions of this Assembly. Yet, despite more than 30 consecutive annual votes of overwhelming support in this hall, this unjust policy persists. It continues to constrain Cuba's capacity to modernize its economy, limits access to medicines, technology, and markets, and undermines the aspirations of a resilient people whose spirit of cooperation has enriched our collective humanity. Mr. President, during the recent high-level general debate, voices from every region, particularly across the Global South, once again called with moral clarity for the immediate and unconditional lifting of this embargo. The President of Ghana joined the chorus of principle when he called for the removal of the blockade on Cuba. As we consider draft resolution A/80/L.6, Ghana will vote firmly in favor. Our support is not born merely of friendship or historical solidarity. It is anchored in law, fairness, and our unwavering belief in a rules-based international order. The extraterritorial application of this embargo imposes undue burdens on third states in clear contravention of international law and the Charter's spirit of sovereign equality. The embargo is not only an issue for Cuba, it is a symbol of the unfinished work of our multilateral system. It impedes progress towards the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and frustrates the collective pursuit of prosperity for the Global South. Cuba's contributions to international cooperation and solidarity, from medical cooperation and education to scientific innovation, demonstrates what is possible when nations choose partnership over punishment. Ghana, like many others, has benefited from that spirit, even amid Cuba's own adversity. In conclusion, Mr. President, Ghana reaffirms her unwavering support for the government and people of Cuba. We call for an end once and for all to this embargo. Let the conscience of this Assembly prevail over the politics of division. Let us restore justice, uphold the Charter, and give meaning to the principle that no nation should prosper at the expense of another's suffering. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ghana. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Solomon Islands.
Mr. President, the delegation aligns itself with the statement delivered by Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 in China and wishes to contribute to the debate in our national capacity. Solomon Islands reaffirms its solidarity with the people of Cuba. We would also like to extend our profound appreciation to the government and the people of Cuba for training more than 100 Solomon Islands medical doctors in Cuba, who are now in hospitals, health centers, and saving lives in our communities. Despite the economic embargo and sanctions, Cuba has been a beacon of health diplomacy. Mr. President, we note with deep concern that the SD's report A/80/83 once again sends a clear message that the embargo remains a stumbling block for Cuba to fully implement the 2030 Agenda and the achievement of the SDGs. We have 5 years left to fulfill the 2030 Agenda, and leaving no one and no country behind should be a priority for all of us to achieve a better future for generations to come. We must strengthen multilateral cooperation in accordance with the United Nations Charter. The prolonged unilateral embargo on Cuba for over 6 decades denies Cuba's right to trade, access to essential goods and services, and violates Cuba's absolute right to development and sovereignty. Mr. President, Solomon Islands does not support unilateral actions or measures that affect the economic and social well-being of another UN member state. These actions are considered inconsistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter. In this regard, we join the international community in calling for an end to the economic, commercial, and financial embargo on Cuba. Finally, Solomon Islands calls for the restoration of friendly relations between the United States and Cuba in the name of peace and within the spirit and purposes of the United Nations Charter. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Solomon Islands. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Nicaragua.
Señor Presidente.
Mr. President, we associate with the statements by the representative of Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and Venezuela on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the United Nations Charter. We greet and welcome the presence of our brother Comrade Bruno Rodriguez, Foreign Minister of Cuba, and his distinguished delegation. We express our fraternal greetings and recognition to him for his bravery and tireless spirit of struggle and victory. We deeply value the information that he will share because it will lay bare the grave damage and challenges that the heroic people of Cuba and beloved people of Cuba continue to face. Mr. President, the practice of imposition by the imperial power, which is freighted with arrogance, is eroding the confidence of peoples in the multilateral system and is distorting the role of the United Nations. Now is the time to break with the unipolar logic and to firmly with dignity and with principles, raise the sovereign voice of the peoples so that we may forge this new multipolar world. The peoples are strengthening their path towards the already obvious multipolar order, forging more just and solidarity-based partnerships rooted in full respect for the sovereignty of states, and firmly challenging the imperialism, colonialism, and neocolonialism that still aims to impose itself over the will of free peoples. Continuing with this imposition, promoting and applying illegal unilateral economic, political, coercive measures or measures of any other type constitute flagrant violations of international law, humanitarian law, and the Charter of the United Nations. It is unacceptable and shameful that some states persist in these inhumane, illegal, arbitrary, and selective measures. They are aggressions that are tools of blackmail and punishment against dignified and independent peoples. We denounce these practices that are incompatible with the United Nations Charter, which violate the sovereignty, self-determination, and right to development of peoples. Mr. President, year after year in this Assembly, we unanimously hear calls for, once and for all, an end to one of the longest, most cruel and anachronistic injustices of our time. The criminal, economic, commercial and financial embargo imposed by the United States against Cuba for more than 6 decades has been the primary instrument of a policy of extreme aggression designed to subjugate the Cuban people, causing pain and suffering in the life of its citizens, choking its economy, trying to bring about a change in government for a sovereign people that will never yield to the designs of the empire. This blockade is a deliberate act of economic warfare, a collective punishment that constitutes a massive violation of the human rights of an entire nation. It is a brazen and absolute disregard for the life, the health, the food, education, the right to development, and the self-determination of this so generous and solidarity-based people, our Cuban brothers and sisters. With each day that goes by, the devastating consequences of the blockade are worsening the situation of millions of Cubans in every area, limiting Cuba's ability to access medicines, technologies, food, and financial resources, affecting its productive capacity, having an impact on its sustainable development programs and the implementation of the 2030 Agenda. In this same context of harassment, we also see the unjust and arbitrary inclusion of the sister Republic of Cuba on the infamous illegal United States list, which falsely accuses Cuba of sponsoring terrorism. This is slander and aggression that aims to justify the unjustifiable. Cuba only sponsors life, cooperation, and fraternity. That is the list that Cuba participates in with honor. In the face of this aggression, Cuba's dignity is held up as a beacon of resistance. Cuba, that giant of international solidarity, which remains standing and continues to, in solidarity, share its education, health, science, and hope with the peoples of the world. Thousands upon thousands of doctors, teachers, engineers, sportsmen, and Cuban professionals of other sorts have brought health, education, and sport to the farthest flung corners of the planet. Its medical brigades have always been the first to provide unconditional assistance in the context of natural disasters and epidemics. And the vast majority of countries here present, including developed countries, we know this very well and we are grateful for it. And thus, Cuba is writing the brightest pages in the history of revolutionary internationalism and the humanitarian socialist essence of its glorious revolution. Mr. President, 33 years ago, this Assembly declared that the blockade against Cuba is unjustifiable and illegal, in spite of the attempts of the United States to reframe it with unjustified interference-based arguments, and therefore this Assembly also has the obligation to uphold these resolutions. Nicaragua is a living and grateful witness to Cuban solidarity. In the most robust terms, we condemn this illegal, immoral, and inhumane embargo imposed against Cuba, and we demand its immediate, total, and unconditional end. The peoples of the world, including those of the United States, are calling for the end of this blockade. They stand with Cuba, alongside it, walking together with it, because solidarity is stronger than blackmail, because history and justice will always be with the peoples that do not sell themselves short and do not give in. Mr. President, we are certain that international solidarity with Cuba will continue to grow as an expression of shared dignity. With the approval of this resolution, the General Assembly will once again firmly raise its voice in condemnation of this criminal economic war and all of its manifestations and extraterritorial effects, which continue to intensify against the sister republic of Cuba. Nicaragua, as it does every year, affirms its respect, admiration and eternal affection for Cuba, and will vote in favor of the draft resolution A/80/L6, reiterating our support, our recognition, and our gratitude to the dear and generous people and government of Cuba, whose heroism and example is faithful to their internationalist vocation. They are always ready to contribute with their experience to the common good of humanity. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of Nicaragua. I now give the floor to His Excellency Bruno Eduardo Rodriguez Parilla, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba, to introduce draft resolution A/80/L6.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, I express profound condolences and solidarity to the governments and people of Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, who have suffered loss of life following the passage of Hurricane Melissa. Also to Panama, that has also suffered some damage due to intense rain. Also our best wishes to the Bahamas and Bermuda. I speak on behalf of a people who right now, with scarce resources and practically only by sheer will, unity and solidarity, are coping with a monstrous hurricane. As we heard yesterday from the leader of the Cuban Revolution, Raul Castro Ruiz, and I quote, "In light of this new challenge, we will also rise victorious." We have heard the infamous, threatening, arrogant, deceitful, and cynical statement made by the new permanent representative of the United States, who is not here in the room. That it came as no surprise, knowing as we do where this character comes from, as well as his shady links with the Secretary of State and the mafia of military contractors, as well as the political mafia of Miami. Yesterday, from this rostrum, he said that he was going to refer to facts, but he did quite the opposite. I will just recall what he seems to ignore despite his responsibilities, or even worse, what he perhaps even distorts with a mendacious spirit, the laws and rules of his country's economic aggression against Cuba are not ambiguous in terms of their actions and ambitions. They openly declare in law their goal, which is to restrict Cuba's commercial, investment and credit relations with all countries. They also establish in law the obligation on U.S. diplomats to comply with that mandate during their contacts with officials from other governments, the governments that you represent. I would recommend reading from my colleagues from the U.S. Title I and Title III of the Helms-Burton Act, as well as the content of the Torricelli Act. Action speaks louder than words, and I will refer to such action in crystal clear terms. This Assembly will decide for itself, as it has done now for 33 years, whether this item is an economic blockade or not. Over the last few weeks, there has been a brutal and unprecedented deployment of pressure, intimidation, and toxicity by the State Department at the planetary level to force sovereign states to change their vote on the resolution that we will adopt today. They have resorted to all of their weapons and tricks, especially coercion. But the truth, law, reason, and justice are always far more powerful and overwhelming. It's not possible to hide the fact that by virtue of the United States government's criminal policy against Cuba, my country is viciously deprived in every corner of the world of the use of banking systems to make payments and collect funds. Cuba is deprived of access to sources of financing, investment capital, remittances, technology for its industry, food production, infrastructure, scientific development, and services, including the most sensitive ones, such as healthcare. The strategic aim of the blockade is to provoke a social breakdown that would lead to the breakdown of constitutional order that Cubans have decided to freely form in various referenda. The Secretary of State is the malign, corrupt, and fraudulent reincarnation of Mr. Mallory, and the permanent representative has come to speak on his behalf. As you know, the impact of this type of aggression is not only economic. It applies by design with cold premeditation in terms of its social and humanitarian impact on millions of people. In Cuba, for instance, recent years, and I say so with pain, the deterioration of some health indicators, which, although they are still outstanding for a developing country and comparable to those of industrialized countries, are today lower than the indices that our country was able to progressively achieve. One example of this is infant mortality, which, after consecutive years with rates below 5 per 1,000 live births, now stands at 8.5 in the first half of this year. One would have to lie, as indeed was done by the permanent representative of the United States, to ignore the link between this result and the impact of the economic blockade on the sustainability of our health system. Just as it would be impossible to ignore the impact of the economic blockade on life expectancy or maternal mortality rates or the availability of highly subsidized medicines for the population. Between March 1st, 2024 and February 28th, 2025 alone, the blockade caused Cuba some $7.5 billion in material damage. This is an impact similar to the nominal gross domestic product of at least 30 countries that are represented here, according to World Bank data. But the damage of the blockade cannot only be seen in figures and material damage, rather we see it on the daily lives of our citizens. No one, no family or sector escapes its daily devastating effects. Dialianis, a young Cuban lady, 29 years of age, suffering from hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is a potentially life-threatening condition, requires the implant of an automatic defibrillator that Cuba does not have access to. Dialianis and many other Cuban patients with similar illnesses are still waiting for this type of implant. 6-year-old Abdiel needs a hip operation that requires a bone graft. This sort of tissue is produced at the tissue bank in the Frank Pais Hospital, but the essential freeze-drying process has been halted due to the lack of a sensor. It has not been possible to purchase it, even with the money to pay for it, because the companies that supply it, in light of the blockade against Cuba, refused to sell it in accordance with usual commercial practices. This is not collateral damage. These are not isolated cases. These are everyday experiences. These are human beings, innocent human beings who are suffering. The creativity of our institutions and the professionals who work within them is extraordinary and highly commendable, but it is impossible to calculate the anguish that this situation wreaks on Cuban families, or the strain of not being able to access these medicines and supplies when they're needed. An essential component of the worsening blockade since 2019 has been increased persecution on fuel supply operations, including shipping companies, insurance companies, banks, and governments. This has led in Cuba to a reduction in suppliers and an exponential rise in prices. Electric cuts or blackouts are today one of the most visible and irritating impacts of the economic blockade against Cuba, having a daily effect on families, which is at times exasperating. It has an impact on other sectors such as water supply, production processes, services, and the economy as a whole, all of which weighs on the population. Just a few months ago, one corporation from a country and the friendly government of that country stated that it was impossible for them to supply one spare part and mere technical assistance to repair a large thermo power station in Cuba due to the threat of sanctions by the US. Another vital sector of the economy that has been particularly damaged is tourism. Today, citizens from more than 40 countries are being intimidated and threatened with reprisals by the US government if they decide to visit Cuba, as well as prohibition on accessing the e-visa ESTA system, without being, even though they might decide freely to exercise their right to visit Cuba. The US government not only deprives its citizens of the right to travel to Cuba, but it also seeks and manages to deprive, through coercion, citizens from other countries that are not under its jurisdiction of those rights, especially from Europe. One of the measures that has the greatest impact is the unjustifiable presence of Cuba in the unilateral and arbitrary list published by the United States government of states allegedly sponsoring terrorism. Cuba is a victim of terrorism. So we have previously demonstrated before this assembly. For years and even today, terrorist acts against the country have been and are still being organized and financed from U.S. territory. These terrorists live here peacefully and with absolute impunity. These are the notorious perpetrators of horrific acts of aggression against Cuban people, resulting in thousands of dead, maimed, and extensive material damage. In 2023, we handed over to the U.S. government the names and information on 62 terrorists and 20 terrorist organizations acting against Cuba from this country, and so far the U.S. government has done nothing about it. The economic warfare includes a comprehensive program of destabilization, and I will condemn this action for the first time here. This includes a comprehensive program of destabilization financed, organized, and executed directly by the United States government through the use of operatives of Cuban origin based in this and other countries. Their mission and their assignment is to lower the incomes of the Cuban population through speculative manipulation of the exchange rate. This has a direct impact on price increases, spreading intimidating and alarming messages on social media, as well as a consequent change to the market's natural operation. The effect of this is severe harm to the pockets of every Cuban and additional obstacles to macroeconomic stabilization programs. To do this, they resort to the laundering of money from the U.S. federal budget, using funds assigned by the U.S. Congress and used by the State Department, several non-governmental organizations, and contractors that channel such funds. Our government has irrefutable evidence of these operations. This includes data, names, contacts, communications, and the direct involvement of the U.S. government and its diplomats. This is a criminal activity that is contrary to international law, Cuban laws, and even United States laws. The United States has tried to sell the idea that the blockade is a justification used by the Cuban government to hide its inefficiencies or the errors of its development model. This political campaign is based on a propaganda and digital campaign which uses toxic disinformation, euphemisms, selective silence, and the coordinated saturation of messages, seeking to establish the perception that the blockade does not exist or does not affect the population. The United States government not only attempts to deny or minimize the blockade, but also penalizes those who document its harm and consequences by resorting to smear campaigns, cyber troops paid with the funds earmarked for a regime change, and the algorithmic censorship of Cuban national content. Anyone denying the Cuban problems on Cuba would be lying and is lying. Indeed, the proponents of this blockade publicly undermine its effects and its ability to affect the living conditions of an entire people. Please look back at the statements of the United States Secretary of State and politicians who have made their careers and built their wealth with aggression on Cuba. If the United States government has any slight concern in trying to help the Cuban people, as they say they do, they should either suspend or make humanitarian exceptions to the blockade as a result of the harm that it is causing and that is being caused by Hurricane Melissa. Cuba is a peace-loving country. No one in their right mind with a modicum of honesty can claim that Cuba represents or intends to represent a threat to the national security of the United States, and which is a great power, nor to the well-being of the American people. Which country has military forces deployed in an aggressive, extraordinary, and unjustified manner in the Caribbean Sea as we hold our discussions here? Which country threatens regional peace, security, and stability, particularly the peace and right to self-determination of the kindred Venezuelan people? Which country has adopted the criminal practice of ordering its armed forces to commit murders in the high seas or within the territorial or jurisdictional waters of other countries, as we see today in the Caribbean or in the Pacific? Which country has our region riddled with military bases and openly plots aggressive plans of subversion and regime change against progressive governments? Which government is the direct accomplice, the provider of weapons and financing for the genocide in Gaza? If the United States government wishes to contribute to peace in our America, it should withdraw the military threat and accept a civilized dialogue without preconditions or impositions with Venezuela, with Colombia, with Nicaragua, with Cuba, and with all countries with which it has differences, and collectively with the community of Latin American and Caribbean states. The blockade is a policy of collective punishment. It qualifies as an act of genocide. It flagrantly, massively, and systematically violates the human rights of Cubans. It makes no distinction between social sectors or economic actors. I'm very grateful to those who in this debate and in the high-level segment in this session spoke up to request the end of the blockade and the removal of our country from the spurious list of state sponsors of terrorism. I'd also like to thank the regional groups who over the years have made robust statements in this regard, to the numerous organizations and movements of solidarity, standing in solidarity with Cuba around the world, and Americans who call for a relationship based on respect and sovereign equality between both countries. I recognize the expressions of Cubans in the United States and around the world who, through their statements and supportive patriotic actions, are opposed to and fight against the blockade. Cuba will not surrender. We will persist in speaking up against the infamy. We will exercise our right decisively to decide on our own fate. We will continue in our efforts to overcome the current difficulties and to ensure the economic sustainability of the country, even with the continuation or even with the subsequent strengthening of the blockade. With Jose Marti, our people reaffirmed today that in order to, before giving up on the effort to make our homeland prosperous and free, the South Sea will join the North Sea and a serpent will hatch from an eagle's egg. And from Antonio Maceo, who tried to take over Cuba. I recall he said, "Whoever tries to take over Cuba will gather the dust of its blood-soaked soil if they do not perish in the struggle. And with Fidel Castro Ruiz, we shout once again, homeland or death, we shall overcome." Madam President, on behalf of the noble and fraternal people of Cuba, who for decades have been working on an admirable feat of patriotism, justice, resistance, creation, and sacrifice, I respectfully request all member states to vote in favor of draft resolution A/AT/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Distinguished ambassadors, delegates, doing so would be an act of justice in favor of a peace-loving people that today is facing not only the blockade, but with the blockade, another monstrous hurricane. Thank you.
I thank the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Cuba. We have heard the last speaker in the debate for this item. We shall now proceed to consider draft resolution A/80/L6. Before giving the floor for explanations of vote, before the vote, may I remind delegations that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Poland on behalf of the group.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished delegates. I have the honor to speak on behalf of Czechia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Poland. Our position on this matter is rooted in a single non-negotiable principle: the UN Charter standing at the center of our work, promoting peace and security through consistent adherence of the international law. As such, our overriding duty is to work together toward peace and respect the sovereignty of all member states. We recognize, as we have constantly done in the past, that the embargo and the connected measures are negatively affecting the living standards of the Cuban people. The humanitarian consequences of this situation are clear, and we remain dedicated to alleviating suffering wherever it occurs. We reiterate our readiness to share our experience and assist Cuban government in Pacific political and economic transformation that would set the country on a path towards modernization and sustainable growth. Let me also express our full solidarity with those affected by the current devastating hurricane. At the same time, we find ourselves unable to further fully engage in a debate that has been politically selective for years. We must observe with regret that a state which today calls for the strict observance of the international law in the context of this resolution has for years supported Russia in its war of aggression against Ukraine, that itself is in a stark breach of the UN Charter. On top of its political support, the government of Cuba is turning a blind eye on the active participation of its nationals in an illegal war of aggression elsewhere in the world. We refer specifically to the large number of Cuban nationals who are participating in the ongoing Russian aggression against Ukraine just across our borders. This foreign involvement constitutes a clear violation of the core provisions of the UN Charter itself. We strongly urge Cuba, once again, to take all necessary measures to prevent its nationals from joining Russian military forces and to ensure accountability for any Cuban involvement in the action that contributes to Russia's aggression. Additionally, we also call on Russia not to exploit the economic difficulties of the people around the world by engaging them in an illegal war of aggression. Such actions result not only in a severe deterioration of the economic and humanitarian situation in the attacked country, but actively result in depriving people of their homes, causing deaths, casualties, and immense suffering. This is an unacceptable discrepancy. As a result, our vote to abstain today should be understood as a rejection of the selective application of the UN Charter. True justice and lasting peace demand that states constantly uphold the laws they demand others to follow. And I thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Poland. I now give the floor to Namibia.
Thank you, Madam President. I express solidarity with the nationals of the Caribbean who are going through Hurricane Melissa. Madam President, Namibia takes the floor in explanation of the vote before the vote on the draft resolution before us. The year 2025 marks 66 years since the friendly government and people of the Republic of Cuba have been under the inhuman and unilateral economic, financial, and commercial blockade by the United States. This blockade is contrary to international law and the Charter of the United Nations, which was created to, amongst others, develop friendly relations amongst nations based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. Peace is exactly what the government and the brave people of Cuba brought to Namibia when they fought side by side with the people of Namibia for our independence. During our struggle, Namibian refugees were also welcomed in Cuba, many of whom returned to build our country and helped to chart the way for our development. However, to date, the right to development of the people of Cuba continues to be curtailed through the imposed unilateral coercive measures by the world's most largest economy. The importation of food, equipment, and other essential material in Cuba is severely curtailed, affecting the ability of Cuba to effectively engage in global trade. Notwithstanding all the challenges the Cuban people have had to face and endure over all these years, they are a resilient people. Cuba has spared no efforts in contributing to the welfare of millions of people around the world through its selfless contributions in so many cases where natural disasters and adversity had struck, or through science, technology advancement, training, and capacity building, support to the international community, and the deployment of medical professionals, and much of the world, of the developing world. Madam President, in his statement, in his State of the Nation Union address to Congress on 20th January 2015, the former President of the United States of America, Barack Obama, called on lawmakers to lift the embargo against Cuba, stating in his own words, and I quote, "In Cuba, we are ending a policy that was long past its expiration date. When what you are doing doesn't work for 50 years, it's time to try something new. And our shift in Cuba policy has the potential to end a legacy of mistrust in our hemisphere. It removes a phony excuse for restrictions in Cuba," end of quote. This statement is still valid today. However, since June 2017, during the first term of the current President of the United States, measures against Cuba were tightened. This embargo is not only a bilateral issue between Cuba and the United States of America, as we are made to believe. It hinders and affects international cooperation with Cuba. In this 80th year of existence of the United Nations, we call on all good officers of the Secretary General and the United Nations to facilitate dialogue between these two countries with the hope of reversing these restrictions while working towards the normalization of relations between the two countries. Finally, Madam President, we call for the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism as a sign towards improving relations between the two countries. Namibia will not deviate from voting in favor of this resolution, and we invite other member states to do the same in solidarity with the people of Cuba. I thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Namibia. We have heard the last speaker in explanation of vote before the vote. The Assembly will now take a decision on draft resolution A/80/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Recorded vote has been requested. We shall now begin the voting process. Those in favor of draft resolution A/80/L6, please signify. Okay. Those against? Abstentions?
The Assembly is now voting on draft resolution A/80/L6 entitled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial and Financial Embargo imposed by the United States of America against Cuba. Will all delegations confirm that the votes are accurately reflected on the screen? The voting has been completed. Please lock the machine.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor, 165, against 7, abstentions 12. Draft resolution A/80/L6 is adopted. Before giving the floor for explanation of vote after the vote, may I remind delegations again that they are strongly urged to limit explanations of vote to 5 minutes, which should in any case not exceed 10 minutes and be made from their seats. As the first speaker, I give the floor to Denmark on behalf of a group of member states.
Thank you, Madam President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the following European Union member states: Austria, Belgium, Croatia, Cyprus, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Italy, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Portugal, Slovakia, Slovenia, Spain, and Sweden. President, as in previous occasions, I reiterate today our conviction that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed by the United States on Cuba has a damaging impact on the economic situation of the country and negatively affects the living standard of the Cuban people. We should not forget that external trade and foreign investment, which are de facto undermined by the embargo, can play a crucial role in setting the country on a path towards modernization, reforms, and sustainable growth, and help the population overcome the economic hardship it endures. The embargo continues to restrict Cuba's ability to import essential commodities for its economy and population, including, among others, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and other medical supplies. We consider that lifting the embargo could make economic reforms more effective and facilitate the opening of the Cuban economy to the benefit of the Cuban people. We remain concerned about the human rights situation in Cuba, in particular following the events of July 2021, about the severe judgment issued by Cuban courts so far, and about the respect of civil and political rights. We therefore reiterate our call on the Cuban government to fully grant its citizens internationally recognized civil, political, and economic rights and freedoms, including freedom of assembly, freedom of expression and demonstration, and free access to information, to release all political prisoners and those arbitrarily detained, to ratify the UN Covenant for Civil and Political Rights and the Covenant for Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and to extend a standing invitation to all UN special procedures to visit Cuba. We strongly emphasize the importance of upholding the UN Charter and respecting the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all UN members, and urge Cuba to stand in full solidarity with those fundamental principles and work together for their defense. All states have a duty to prevent and not to facilitate violations of international law. In light of reports regarding the alleged participation of Cuban nationals in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, we strongly urge Cuba to take all necessary and effective measures to prevent its nationals from joining Russian military forces involved in this war. We call for full accountability for war crimes and the most serious crimes committed in connection with Russia's war and aggression against Ukraine. We deplore the exploitation of the economic difficulties of people in developing countries to lure them into participating in a war of aggression in violation of the UN Charter. We further believe that empowering civil society is essential for the promotion and protection of all human rights, and call upon the Cuban government to open spaces for constructive and inclusive dialogue without preconditions with the whole spectrum of civil society actors on the island. We consider that positive change in Cuba is best brought about by closer engagement at all levels: government, economy, civil society, but also through people-to-people exchanges. We therefore welcome any measures towards this end, including those aimed at easing restrictions on family remittances and travel to the islands, and at ensuring the availability of full consular services. The designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism and its maintenance on the US list until today has led to additional obstacles to international financial transactions with the island. We therefore call for its removal. Beyond the damaging impact of the embargo and the SST listing on ordinary Cubans, US sanctions and other administrative and judicial measures are also negatively affecting EU economic interests. We have firmly and continuously opposed any such measures due to their extraterritorial application and impact on the European Union in violation of commonly accepted rules of international trade. We cannot accept that such measures impede our economic and commercial relations with Cuba. We strongly reject the US activation of Title III and IV of the Helms-Burton Act in April 2019. This breaches the commitments made by the US in the US-EU agreements of 1997 and 1998. We intend to draw on all appropriate measures to address the effects of the Helms-Burton Act, including in relation to our WTO rights and through the use of the EU's blocking statute and other possible relevant measures to protect EU citizens, businesses, and NGOs operating in Cuba or with Cuba against the extraterritorial application of those US sanctions. Madam President, international cooperation, frank and sustained dialogue, and closer, even critical, engagement are the way to go with Cuba. The provisional application of the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement is now in its 8th year. We are enhancing dialogue and cooperation also on issues on which we have fundamental differences. To this end, the PDCA includes, amongst others, a human rights dialogue, which is a key pillar of our relationship. In order to overcome the current economic and social crisis, we call on Cuba to ensure that its reform agenda includes the necessary economic, judicial, and social reforms, and is implemented in a manner that addresses the key concerns of the Cuban population and meets the legitimate democratic aspirations of the Cuban people for more opportunities to participate in the shaping of the country's future. With the EU-Cuba Political Dialogue and Cooperation Agreement, the EU offers Cuba a consistent and reliable instrument to support a progressive reform of its political and economic model, to pursue sustainable development, and to find common solutions to global challenges, while continuing to advocate for democracy and respect for human rights in the interest of all Cuban citizens. It is our view that the US embargo and connected measures do not contribute to promoting these aims. Against this background, we voted in favor of the draft resolution. I thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Denmark. I now give the floor to the Speaker of Sri Lanka, followed by Australia and the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Sri Lanka aligns itself with the statements delivered by Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement and Iraq on behalf of the Group of 77 and China, and wishes to make the following remarks in its national capacity. Sri Lanka remains deeply concerned by the continued imposition of unilateral coercive measures against Cuba for over 6 decades, which run counter to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and the norms of international law. It is evident that the unilateral actions imposed on Cuba had negative consequences for the well-being of the civilians and for the economic and social development of the country. In this context, Sri Lanka voted in favor of the resolution A/80/L.C titled Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba, along with 164 other countries. Madam President, Sri Lanka is concerned by the barriers created by this embargo, particularly in the area of procurement of medical supplies, vaccines, and essential equipment, especially during health emergencies. The humanitarian consequences of such restrictions are unacceptable. Access to healthcare must not be politicized or constrained by extraterritorial economic measures. We also noted the impacts of the embargo on the food and agriculture sector in Cuba. The economic sanctions on Cuba prevent its acquisition of fertilizers, machinery, fuel, and advanced technology, resulting in a significant decrease in food production. Such obstructions to progress in the agriculture sector in Cuba have a direct impact on its effort to reach food security in the country. Unfortunately, the most vulnerable segment in these situations is women and children. At a time when the world is collectively taking action to end global hunger, we should not use sanctions to promote hunger in another country. Madam President, we believe the time has come to lift this embargo. There is no doubt that this embargo hinders Cuba's pathway to sustainable development, violates fundamental human rights of Cuban citizens. The blockade had incurred billions of losses to the Cuban economy. Regardless of the intention of the embargo, the reality is clear. It is ordinary citizens who suffer the most. Therefore, Cubans should get equal opportunities as people in other nations. Their right to health, right to food, and the right to education have to be respected. Free flow of trade should be allowed. Humanity over hatred should prevail. Sri Lanka has continuously supported the adoption of this resolution over the years. We reiterated that obligations set forth in the UN Charter should be addressed with urgency. I thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Sri Lanka. I now give the floor to the Speaker of Australia, followed by the United States and Nicaragua.
Thank you, President. I speak on behalf of Australia and New Zealand. We voted in support of this annual resolution concerning the embargo against Cuba because the embargo restricts open trade and investment. This vote does not reflect an endorsement of the policies of Cuba, including widespread reports of failures to comply with international human rights standards, expropriation of property, misinformation and disinformation, and Cuban nationals fighting as part of Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine. Australia and New Zealand remain concerned by the human rights situation in Cuba, which has continued to deteriorate following the Cuban government's heavy-handed response to peaceful protests in 2021 and ongoing restrictions on the freedom of expression and association affecting everyday Cubans. We take this opportunity to urge the Cuban government to respect the rights of all its population and call for the release of all political prisoners and those who are arbitrarily detained. Thank you, President.
I thank the Speaker of Australia. I now give the floor to the Speaker of the United States, followed by Nicaragua and Israel.
Madam President, colleagues, let me begin by offering my thoughts and prayers to the people of Jamaica, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, the Bahamas, and Cuba, who are enduring the brutal effects of Hurricane Melissa. The United States shares strong people-to-people bonds with these countries and hopes for minimal damage and loss of life. Unfortunately, the political show by the Cuban regime in New York continues unabated. Yesterday, we witnessed a shameful breach of decorum in this hall. It's obvious the truth hurts because the Cuban delegation attempted to interrupt our speech in order to prevent the truth from being heard. The misuse of a point of order was crude and disrespectful to this institution. The United States will not shrink from speaking truth about the abuses of the Cuban regime. Its failings are the cause of its economic dysfunction, and it continues to collaborate with enemies and adversaries of the United States against our interests, including actively supporting Russia's war in Ukraine. The United States government is satisfied to see so many countries send the regime a message that the international community will no longer tolerate its lies. Its continual plea for international aid, while it refuses to make any political, economic, or social reforms. Its support for rogue states and international terrorists, and most of all, its repression of the Cuban people. The regime is now at a crossroads. It can double down on the failed policies of its past, which will lead to more suffering on the island and more international isolation. Or it can finally abandon its failed, discredited Marxist-Leninist policies and restore to its people their fundamental freedoms. There are consequences for the people in rural Cuba, who are only getting 3 to 4 hours of electricity a day, while the regime continues to invest in tourist hotels and hide billions of US dollars in overseas bank accounts. It has consequences for the people of Venezuela, 8 million of whom have fled their homes due to the failed and repressive policies of Comrade Maduro, supported politically and militarily by the Cuban regime, whom itself has forced 1.8 million Cubans to leave their homes since 2021. Combined with the more than 1.5 million from the other authoritarian dictatorship in the hemisphere, Nicaragua, these draconian policies have put immense pressure on all the nations of the hemisphere. The status quo changes nothing. A vote in support of this regime gives it the excuse it seeks to wash its hands of any culpability for its financial crisis and continue to play the blame game instead of implementing meaningful reforms. The first step on Cuba's path to restore fundamental freedoms to its people, which it must take without caveats or preconditions, is to release all unjustly detained political prisoners that remain in prisons around the island. In the meantime, the United States will continue to promote accountability for the communist regime and their reprehensible behavior on and off the island. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker of the United States. I now give the floor to the Speaker of Nicaragua, followed by Israel and Ukraine.
Señora Presidenta.
Madam President, as the Assembly once again expresses its support to Cuba and for the 33rd time in a row calls for an immediate ending of the United States blockade against Cuba, the world has witnessed this decisive solidarity with Cuba and the erroneous and illegal nature of the criminal blockade by the United States against Cuba. As we have all heard, these grateful expressions and expressions of solidarity towards Cuba over the past 2 days came especially from the representatives of the biggest, most significant groups that we participate in and belong to in the United Nations. such as the statement by Iraq on behalf of the G77 and China, Uganda on behalf of the non-aligned movement, Turkey on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, Barbados on behalf of CARICOM, Guinea-Bissau on behalf of the African Group, Singapore on behalf of ASEAN, and Eritrea on behalf of the Group of Friends in Defense of the Charter of the United Nations. The denunciation of this blockade against Cuba is universal. Only the country that applies it, the United States, was the only country that tried to justify its own anachronistic policy. As has been said throughout this debate, it is clear that there is universal support for Cuba from the entire world, and also it is clear that this criminal blockade is, in and of itself, the most serious, systematic, and flagrant violation of the human rights of the Cuban people. Moreover, it was made plain that there is a total rejection by countries of Cuba's inclusion on the illegal and unilateral list of state sponsors of terrorism. Nicaragua voted in favor of the resolution just adopted, and in so doing reaffirms its unshakable solidarity with the heroic Cuban Revolution, with its government and its people that are an example of dignity, resistance, and international solidarity. We reiterate that the only legitimate path is respectful dialogue on the basis of sovereign equality without conditions nor threats. Madam President, lastly, we would like to express our full solidarity with the peoples of our great Caribbean, Jamaica, Cuba, Haiti, and other Caribbean states that, as we speak, are facing the disastrous consequences of the weather phenomenon Hurricane Melissa. We express our condolences to the families and governments over the loss of life. These increasingly frequent and extreme tragedies are the consequences of global warming and the climate crisis, which has been accelerated by the failure to comply with legally binding commitments made by developed countries under the United Nations Framework Convention and also the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. The failure to comply with that by developed countries makes these phenomena increasingly disastrous in the Greater Caribbean. Thank you very much.
I thank the Speaker of Nicaragua and now give the floor to the Speaker of Israel, followed by Ukraine and Peru.
Madam President, yesterday this hall witnessed an unacceptable display of disrespect when the Cuban delegation attempted to silence the United States during its statement. The blatant abuse of a point of order was a clear affront to the dignity and procedures of this institution. It is very unfortunate, though not surprising, to see such misuse of procedural rules in an attempt to undermine the core values of the United Nations, including freedom of speech. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker of of Israel. I now give the floor to the Speaker of Ukraine, followed by Peru and Romania.
Madam President, Ukraine voted against the draft resolution L.6. This decision reflects our growing concern over Cuba's involvement in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. Let me be clear, this vote is not against the Cuban people. On the contrary, we deeply value the Cuban nation, and we respect its right to live in prosperity. For many decades, Ukrainians and Cubans have been connected by genuine human bonds. Our vote is against the inaction of Cuba's government in the face of recruitment of its citizens into Russia's military, which brings death and devastation to Ukraine. There is no secret that since 2022, to sustain its aggression, Russia has been actively recruiting foreign citizens to fight in its ongoing war against Ukraine. Among them, nationals of the Republic of Cuba constitute the largest group of mercenaries serving in the Russian army. I repeat, the largest group. Our defense forces have taken numerous Cuban nationals as prisoners of war fighting alongside Russian troops. At least several thousand Cuban citizens have signed contracts joining the ranks of soldiers directly engaged in combat operations on Ukrainian soil. This massive recruitment is not a matter of isolated Cuban individuals acting on their own. No, it's a systematic practice involving illicit networks that operate openly with the knowledge and, we must conclude, with tacit condemnation of the authorities in Havana. Madam President, Cuban citizens are drawn into Russia's war through deception, financial incentives, or ideological motives rooted in Moscow's narrative of the so-called historic brotherhood. Russia tries to justify these activities by portraying its military invasion as an alleged anti-colonial struggle. In fact, the recruitment of mercenaries to wage an aggressive war is yet another manifestation of Russia's neo-colonial and imperial policy, exploiting both foreign citizens and its own indigenous minority peoples as cannon fodder. There is no justification for such legal actions. The General Assembly has qualified them as an aggression in violation of the UN Charter that must cease immediately. Yet the principles of the Charter do not appear to guide Cuba, whose president wished Putin success in special military operation against Ukraine. Let me ask bluntly, what kind of success does Havana wish to Moscow? Success in annihilating Ukrainians, success in destroying energy infrastructure on the eve of winter, or success in causing an environmental disaster? That is precisely what Russia has been doing in Ukraine with the support of Cuban mercenaries serving in the ranks of the Russian army. Madam President, this massive recruitment of Cuban mercenaries must be taken very seriously. It is often carried out through a network of companies that maintain connections with local criminal groups and corrupt officials. Despite all the statements that we heard of Cuba's government rejecting claims of its involvement in Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, the systematic deployment of Cuban citizens has not been interrupted. Cuba's declared zero-tolerance policy towards mercenarism is just a fairy tale that clearly contradicts the facts on the ground, as the number of Cuban mercenaries remains very high. Madam President, let me conclude. The unwillingness of Cuba's government to stop massive recruitment of its nationals in the Russian war against Ukraine constitutes complicity in aggression and must be condemned in stronger terms. For this reason, Ukraine voted against the draft resolution L.6. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Ukraine. I now give the floor to the Speaker of Peru, followed by Romania.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation would like to begin by expressing its solidarity with the people of Cuba and other peoples of the Caribbean following the effects of the Hurricane Melissa that they're suffering at the moment. Peru voted in favor of this resolution, guided by a constant, firm belief that respect for international law and the purposes and principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. These foundations, which include the sovereign equality of states, non-intervention in internal affairs, the peaceful settlement of disputes, and international cooperation, are the essential pillars of the international order. They represent basic elements of Peruvian foreign policy, which is a state policy. In line with the international legal framework, only the Security Council is empowered to establish coercive measures in the exercise of its mandate in maintaining international peace and security. This is a position that Peru has traditionally defended, and it is the only path to honor and consolidate the United Nations, whose 80th anniversary we have just commemorated just a few days ago. Consistency in the application of these principles contributes to strengthening the credibility of the multilateral system. In voting in favor, as we have consistently done for more than 3 decades, Peru reaffirms its commitment to a constant, predictable foreign policy underpinned by respect for the UN Charter. preserving the principles and purposes of the Charter is essential to guarantee regional and global coexistence governed by clear, stable, and universally accepted norms. Madam President, respect for sovereignty and non-interference must be complemented by permanent attention to the situation of human rights and fundamental freedoms in all countries, without distinction. Indeed, the promotion and defense of human rights represents an erga omnes obligation. All states parties to the United Nations have the duty to promote human rights and fundamental freedoms and to cooperate with the universal system to ensure their full force. Peru believes that the economic, commercial, and financial blockade can never serve as a pretext to undertake violations of fundamental freedoms. To this extent, we urge the Cuban government to keep good faith and to follow the recommendations formulated by United Nations bodies and to take the necessary measures to guarantee the full respect and protection of human dignity for all persons on their territory. True solidarity with the Cuban people demands from the international community that we provide protection to those in need, and respect for international law and the provisions of the UN Charter include, by preference, protection and respect for fundamental freedoms, which is one of the 3 pillars of our organization. Thank you very much.
I thank the Speaker of Peru. I now give the floor to Romania, so far the last speaker.
Madam President, first I would like to express our solidarity with the people of Jamaica, Cuba, and other Caribbean nations who are in the path of Hurricane Melissa. Madam President, Romania has been supporting this resolution for the past decades, acknowledging the impact of the embargo on the Cuban people, as we have consistently explained every time this resolution was brought to the General Assembly. This year, however, Romania abstained in light of recent information regarding significant participation of Cuban nationals alongside Russian Federation forces in its aggression against neighboring Ukraine. As we have clearly stated during relevant debates in the Security Council and the General Assembly, such foreign involvement in an illegal war of aggression is a blatant violation of the UN Charter and international law. We therefore call on the Cuban government to take necessary measures to discontinue the participation of its nationals in this unjustified war, widely condemned in this very hall, including through several resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the Speaker of Romania. We've heard the last speaker in explanation of vote. After the vote, the exercise of the right of reply has been requested. May I remind members that statements in the exercise of the right of reply are limited to 10 minutes for the first intervention and to 5 minutes for the second intervention, and should be made by delegations from their seats. I call on the representative of Cuba.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, the government of the United States knows no other way to justify its hostile policy against Cuba than resorting to constant lies. We all know that the United States government is a pathological liar, but they don't deceive anyone. It's clear that they are in no way concerned by the fate of our people nor their human rights, that the blockade continues to afflict, nor are they interested in regional peace that they threaten with their irresponsible military deployment in the Caribbean Sea. So as to provoke suffering on the Cuban people, they are even able to ensure reiterated cynicism within this United States. With full cynicism, they divert attention from the comprehensive efforts of their suffocation policy. No one can be in doubt of the ability of the United States to strike the economic stability of any country. This is currently being made clear through the imposition of tariffs on numerous countries around the world. In our case, these have been applied for more than 60 years. Madam President, the unjustified permanent presence of Cuba in the unilateral fraudulent list of state sponsors of terrorism is a measure geared towards strengthening the highest pressure policy against our people. Everybody knows, including U.S. security agencies, that Cuba does not sponsor terrorism, and that on the contrary, we have been the victim of this scourge, in particular from what is financed, organized, and protected from the United States territory. The United States deliberately is twisting the situation of human rights in Cuba. There is no more flagrant, massive, systematic violation than the blockade by the United States on Cuba. The United States has no moral authority to give us lectures on human rights to Cuba or anyone else. The government of that country is responsible for extrajudicial executions, abductions, and torture. They detain immigrants, they censor media and journalists. This is the country with a serious problem of public safety, violence, and police brutality. During the current U.S. administration, we have seen an exacerbation of widespread detention, systematic violations of human rights, xenophobia, racism against other phenomena. These are alarming practices which undermine any attempt by the U.S. government to present itself as some kind of example in human rights. They understand how the restriction on the trade between the U.S. and Cuba happens, if we could call it that. If the United States is truly interested in trading with Cuba, they would listen the majority of citizens in their state, in their country, which supports the lifting of the blockade, and would. This is what is justice and reason would tell us to do. Madam President, the government of the United States clearly is lying when accusing Cuba of being involved in people trafficking. We know that this is a narrative, that it is a pretext continuing to support the blockade against Cuba. In holding up Cuban medical support with blackmail against countries that receive such aid, the U.S. is jeopardizing access for hundreds of thousands of people to quality health care. Madam President, I would like to make it very clear that Cuba does not form part of the armed conflict in Ukraine or in any other country. The Cuban government is aware that Cuban nationals, in unprecise figures, have on their own account participated in the military operation on both sides of this conflict. None of these nationals have the consent, the motivation, or any commitment from the Cuban government to participate in that conflict. Madam President, the United States government has no ethicals or scruples or commitment to the truth in order to achieve its strategic interests. In their statement, there is no argument that enjoys the recognition of the international community. They prefer to remain isolated, as they have once again in this assembly, subject to the discredit of the blockade for more than 60 years, rather than accepting their failure in trying to destroy the Cuban Revolution. In light of the attempts to slander and destroy the Cuban Revolution, the people and government of Cuba will stand steadfast in their unwavering decision to continue forging an increasingly inclusive and prosperous society. Thank you.
I thank the Speaker of Cuba. As there's no further request of reply, may I take it that it's the wish of the Assembly to conclude its consideration of Agenda Item 38? It is so decided. The meeting is adjourned. I wish you all a good day.